So the security of your VPNs, routers, switches, it's also like in the crosshairs of attackers today. Attackers realize that it's a great foothold to have in the network because it's exposed to the internet, because they can hide on there and they can use it for a command and control to communicate between the systems they've compromised and systems they own out on the internet. Having this control of these central network and VPN appliances, it's a great foothold for them to be able to communicate and get access from the inside out.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweat, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane and cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird?
Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front. I'm Enrique Oti, the Chief Strategy Officer at Second Front, calling you from beautiful sunny Spain today, where I'm heading out to a European Defense Tech Conference, really looking into everything European defense tech. It is an exciting space to be looking at right now. But today I got an extremely special guest for you, a true cybersecurity professional, a true hacker, Paul Asadoorian, the principal security researcher at Eclypsium. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Enrique. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being on. Looking forward to this conversation. I've been dabbling around the edges of cybersecurity since being a teenager. I think you and I are back around the same generation with our old Apple IIe's, the bulletin boards, early internet days. So yeah, it's good to talk to someone who actually, we live through the same time frames. What I would love to dive into first, though, is your job title, because this was not the job title when I booked you for the show. So you're a principal security researcher, but I thought I was getting an evangelist on the show. So what changed? What went from principal security evangelist to researcher?
It's funny. I've always kind of walked that line between marketing and technical aspects. And previous roles that I've held in similar cybersecurity companies, I've been an evangelist, but also done a lot of technical work as well. And, that continued here at Eclypsium. When I first came to join my friends at Eclypsium, they were like, I actually applied for a researcher position, more of a technical position. And they were like, but you're really strong in marketing and we need help there. I'm like, hey, whatever I can do to help, because I love my job. I love the company. And then recently, due to some, internal changes, I was spending a little more time in research, specifically research and threat detection. So understanding what the threat landscape is out there, and then how we internalize that, maybe in our products, maybe in our research projects that we want to do, just sheer research, and sharing things back in the community, and talking about what we do in the context of what's happening today in vulnerability and security research. So given that I kind of shifted a little more towards the technical, my title changed this week, in fact, so.
Well, congrats on the new role. Now, so as you've switched to being a researcher, what's your focus? What right now is that passionate research project that you're looking at? Because obviously you've been doing cybersecurity research for decades. You've published on it, you've taught on it, you've lectured on it, you've given talks at every conference around on this. So what is it you're looking at right now?
Yeah, I think, straight up Linux firmware is certainly in my crosshairs. I completed, it was a semi-public research project I'll share with you and your audience. I found this project, researchers that had done this project, that they were looking at how firmware updates and whether the firmware was updating securely or not. And in order to test their software that they called Checkup, which checks the firmware's security posture as it updates, they had to go download a whole bunch of firmware. And so one of my recent projects was going and downloading all of that firmware, writing some Python scripts to go do that. And at the end of the project, which is the first phase, I should say, I ended up with about 4 terabytes worth of firmware. So the next phase will be, how can I look at that firmware? What tools are available? What can I modify? What can I glean from all of that firmware, their commonalities? The researchers did some analysis of it, which I think was slightly skewed because they included a whole bunch of open source software. But most of the software they collected was Linux based on a MIPS processor, right? So that was kind of interesting in terms of if I were an attacker, what would I want to attack? Well, what's most popular and prevalent out there on the internet? Well, it's Linux, maybe with this particular, MIPS processor architecture. So that was one really fun research project, which I want to get to the next phase of now. How can I look into that firmware and discover vulnerabilities or other commonalities that would be interesting data points for what we do? I also spend a lot of time looking at network-based appliances and infrastructure. So the security of your VPNs, routers, switches is a pretty big component of our product suite at Eclypsium. It's also like in the crosshairs of attackers today, very much so. And I don't think it's anything other than attackers realize that it's a great foothold to have in the network because it's exposed to the internet, because they can hide on there and be a little more stealthy, and they can use it for a command and control to communicate between the systems they've compromised and systems they own out on the internet. And having this control of these central network and VPN appliances is just it's a great foothold for them to be able to communicate and get access from the inside out.
Well, you talked about pulling in terabytes of this firmware and doing the analysis on it. What do you think of the state of analytical tools for firmware? So, a lot of security analysts out there, I won't say research, but security analysts, people working in SOCs, people working in enterprise, even people on the government side, a lot of tools to look at things like network traffic, net flow, application level vulnerabilities, containerized vulnerabilities. When you start talking about the firmware, most people don't understand that software that's running down at that level on their devices. So what do you think of the state of the tools? Is it getting better? Is the discipline getting more? Is it more people getting into this, or is it getting more focused? What do you think is going on at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's probably about the same. I think a few more people are getting involved in firmware security, thanks to people like Matt Brown, as an example, publishing, a couple of videos a week on how to analyze firmware, how to pull firmware off devices. So certainly, speaking of evangelists, there's evangelists for firmware that I think are helping grow the area of analyzing firmware. From like an operational perspective, one of the things that I'm really excited about and like to promote is the aspect of integrity, right? And there's lots of, there's tools to do that. Our product does it, but it's one of the things that I think is super important from an operationalizing aspect of these firmware-based devices is it running the firmware that it should be running, right? Has it been tampered with? Hasn't been backdoored? Or has it changed, right? So there's two aspects. There's the integrity, like sheer integrity. Is this device running the firmware from the manufacturer, and does it match what the manufacturer says that firmware is, right? That's integrity. The other aspect is baselining. So has that firmware changed over time where it really shouldn't change, right? Like this particular laptop that I used to connect to Zoom has an older UEFI BIOS, and I monitor that to make sure that it hasn't changed because the manufacturer or OEM hasn't provided an update. Therefore, it shouldn't change. And if it does, it's likely an indication that there is an attack.
So when you look at integrity really comes down to, and I'll quote it off your website. Your website actually on the Eclypsium page talks about trust. And I think there's a certain false trust that everybody buys a device and you just trust that it works. You trust the components are valid. You trust that the updates are valid. You trust that wherever those components came for is valid. And so we live in a world of trust, but in many ways it's a false trust, not based off of any evidence. So how are you, I'll ask the corporate question here. How are you guys looking to address this? How are you actually targeting the supply chain to actually give people true trust that what they're running is what they think they got?
Yeah, I think it's a verify and then trust. And one of the things that we're building and promoting is that verification process. And we have industry standards that support a verification process. So secure boot, and we could spend a whole day talking about the intricacies of secure boot and how it was implemented. But the high level is before we had UEFI, we had BIOS, right? And remember when you had to update your BIOS, typically you had to get a floppy disk, right? Put in your computer, boot in that floppy disk, and it would update your BIOS. So that's one problem they were addressing when they came up with UEFI. Intel and Microsoft largely led the charge to define a new standard, to update the UEFI standard to include secure boot, which is basically building a root of trust on your system to validate all of the firmware and software that's involved in the boot process. So when we talk about verify and then trust, we actually have facilities. Secure boot is just an example of one of them, that allows you as the user or organization to validate all of that firmware and software that's involved in the boot process. There's a lot of things that happen from the time you push the power button on your computer to the time you get to a login screen. And so that verification process is super important, because an attacker that controls any of those steps in that boot process, in that early boot phase, gets in before the operating system, right? And that's really where largely we're focused here at Eclypsium. Something I'm passionate about is the operating system security you have today means nothing if an attacker gains higher level privileges before the operating system loads. Now they can blind the operating system and say, just don't look for malware over here, basically, or hey, EDR, like don't look over here, but this is where I'm going to put my malware. So there's a lot of manipulation that can happen before the operating system. So secure boot is a great mechanism for doing that, not without its issues, right? And I don't blame any particular organization or the designers or creators. A lot of it just comes down to, like, revocation is hard. So when we say a piece of software is vulnerable, has a vulnerability, it shouldn't participate in the secure boot process. We have to issue revocations for that. And as we all know, revocations and certificates can get kind of messy. And then there's, vulnerabilities in secure boot. Our founders discovered some of the early vulnerabilities and bypasses for secure boot, which still exist today.
Now, a lot of times when people think about hackers, they think obviously an external actor to the system, breaking into the system, use a lot of code and 3D effects flying around the screen. But the big fear right now that we're seeing in the community, and especially those of us that work in the government and around the government, is obviously the threat of the supply chain itself being compromised by design at inception. And so I'll ask you, you look at where the supply chain is, a lot of systems are dependent on components from China. How real do you think that threat is? Is that supply chain threat real, that because components are manufactured overseas by a potential competitor, that's actually introducing by design weaknesses into the system? Is that a real threat? And then, of course, the follow-up is then, what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a threat. There's a lot of different supply chains, right? Unique supply chains that, if we talk about PC servers and laptops, there's about 30 to 40 different components. Each of those components have hardware as well as firmware. And firmware is just, I like to say firmware is software that's inconvenient to program. So all these components have firmware, and they all have multiple threads in the supply chain, right? The chip, the hardware might come from one manufacturer. The firmware to enable that might come from another manufacturer. A component of that firmware might come from yet another supplier. So there's a lot of basically cooks in the kitchen when you ultimately get your laptop. So the opportunities are there to inject something malicious into the supply chain because there are just so many suppliers involved when we make modern electronics today. A use case that's not necessarily enterprise specific, but certainly keeps me up at night. There's been a lot of research and work done to analyze Android TV set-top boxes. I don't know if you've seen some of this research. You might have seen it in a news clip somewhere on a technology site. But if you just go to Amazon and you purchase an Android TV set-top box, it might cost you, $30. They're very inexpensive. And they come with this bonus. We say they're pre-owned because it comes with malware. And researchers have tried to untangle where in the supply chain that malware has come from. And to date, we really don't have a great answer as to where it comes from. We kind of know what components they installed, the effects of those components, but it's really hard to trace that back because there's, again, so many different suppliers. And so, those types of things have happened and definitely can happen when you produce any kind of electronics device. because there's so many different components from so many different suppliers. And what we do about it is we have to validate it, right? We have to not just analyze the firmware, that's one way, but validate, like, is this firmware really the firmware I should be running, or has it been tampered with? And then we have to observe and monitor the behaviors, both of the firmware itself and also, of course, on the network, right? And looking, should this device be talking to this weird IP address that comes from China, right? And we've seen that. You take a brand new device and you monitor its network communications. You're like, I haven't done anything to this device, but it's phoning home and sending data to all sorts of different locations.
So obviously, understanding those vulnerabilities, understanding the exploits that are there is critical to having real security. Like if you actually want to secure your environment, your infrastructure, your cloud, whatever it is, you have to understand what's going on down at that firmware level. But if you start looking at a lot of things related to compliance and documentation about the systems you buy and implement, especially for people working in government, there's not always explicit reference to that, and there's not always easy ways to check. And so I'd love to ask you, this is kind of a philosophy question I'd love to debate. I love to debate this over scotch with people is, there's always that security and compliance. A lot of people say security versus compliance. I'll say security and compliance. Like you have to do both. If you're a CISO, if you're a CIO, if you're in a company, you have to do security and you have to do compliance. So how do you balance that? And how do you ensure that the tools you're implementing, the processes you're implementing, is a solid balance between the two? Or is it not a balance? It's just you just have to pile them both on top of each other. How do you view that from the companies you've worked with?
Yeah, it's interesting that security and compliance have what I call a relationship. And if it were to have a relationship status, it would be it's complicated. Certainly compliance is great for establishing a baseline, for establishing the things that you should do, and a lot of times you must do. A lot of times we'll frame it as the security kind of basics, which is like a loaded kind of question, right? But it helps an organization define a starting place of what all the components should I have in my security program? How should I architect my security program? Sometimes it gets into more of the technical details. So certain compliance standards will say you have to make sure you update your firmware, for example, improve that on audits. You have to do some kind of supply chain due diligence and improve that on an audit. Other compliance guidance, which I really like, the CSF 2.0, I believe, introduced a lot of guidance into basically how to operationalize your supply chain management, right? How to, in which groups to involve, what types of conversations those groups should have, what processes have to be in place to help you from more of a logistics standpoint. Create a supply chain management program is one great thing that the CSF does.
Now, you've worked in top tier companies, you've delivered solutions to top tier companies, and you're also delivering to the government. Are you seeing a difference with how a top tier commercial company is approaching that balance of security and compliance versus how a government customer end user? Is it the same approach? Or are you seeing it something different? We'll be blunt, like what's working and what's not working in those approaches that those two different entities are taking?
Yeah, I think compliance should be a business enabler, both for the core business itself and also for security, right? Yeah. So a lot of situations that I've experienced are companies come to me or come to a company like Eclypsium and say, we have to be compliant with this, because if we don't, we can't do business with XYZ company, right? Or we've got to get to a FedRAMP status, so because our customers are going to require that. And in that sense, I think it's really positive. And I think, whether it's within the U.S. federal government or whether it's in a commercial entity, they both kind of have the same goals. Like they have to be compliant in order to do business, right? CMMC is a great shining example of that. And I think that, the federal government, the business aspect is obviously different there, but they've certainly got a lot of drivers now that are compliance based. We look at the CISA-KEV in your binding operational directives. I think that program's doing really great, using compliance to ensure that U.S. government entities are basically patching what the attackers are going after and exploiting. Like sometimes it's not rocket science. Like I think that's just a great program that's using compliance to improve people's security. Now, are you done once you've addressed everything on the SysACEV? Absolutely not. But it is a great starting point and a great thing to do. Absolutely.
I think you're the only person I've ever heard say that CMMC is a shining example of something. You didn't say what that something was, and so you might be more of an optimist than me, but I think we've seen a multi-year rollout of a program that has changed multiple times, and I think the jury's still out on whether CMMC is going to actually increase real security. Like, are we going to help defend our industrial base, or is it just going to be a workload and a cost driver put on startups, especially? So I'm glad you think it's a shining example. I hope you're right. I'm still kind of on the fence as to whether that compliance checklist is going to drive us to where we need to be as a nation.
Yeah, I think I probably should be more cautiously optimistic. I think in concept is why I like CMMC as a shining example, right? To say that, hey, if you're going to do business with the U.S. federal government, you have to meet these minimum standards, right? And I want to see that also applied to products. If you're going to make a product and you're going to sell to the U.S. federal government, it should meet some minimum compliance, security compliance standard. And anything that is pushing us in that direction is a great thing in my opinion. I think the FDA has a great example as well, where medical devices now are not going to pass FDA approval unless they meet certain security compliance standards. And we've already seen some actually gotten pulled back and that law went into effect. So,
yeah. Now, I'll definitely agree with you on that one. I think compliance as a theory is great, and we need to make sure that things work when they're delivered to the government. We have to make sure that things are secure. And it's not just, and you're right, it's national security, but it's not just the military. You're right, it is the healthcare industry. It is our food supply chain. It is logistics. Everything we do is all computer-based. And as a nation, we need to make sure our stuff is secure. So compliance, I think, is the right route. I just got to make sure it's delivered correctly. And I think something you mentioned, I think twice before already on this call, is the idea of operationalizing it. So can you expand a little bit on that? So it's one thing to say, okay, I've got a checklist. Yes, I have all the right tools. How do you view operationalizing this type of supply chain security and firmware security as part of day-to-day business for a company?
Yeah, I think it's a continuous monitoring situation where if we look at the firmware attack surface, if you will, it's historically been like, if it's broken, maybe we'll apply a firmware update, or maybe we'll do that every once in a while. Maybe when we first get the system, we'll update all the firmware, but not go back and do it. And the operationalization of that is really doing it all the time as you go, treating it just like you would your applications, your operating system, your other security solutions that you have, and making sure that moving forward, all of your firmware and network appliances, that particular attack surface is up to date with vulnerabilities, with threat detection. And these things can be super difficult because we don't get a lot of visibility into these lower layers, or there's not a lot of visibility when you acquire some VPN or network appliance. We tend to trust the vendor that they've done their due diligence to provide us a secure product. But when we look under the covers, maybe that's not the case all the time. So we have a shared responsibility where we have to also look at, well, what's inside that box? Is it patched against all the latest vulnerabilities? Are there things that we can look for indicators of compromise on our network appliances, inside the firmware that lives inside of all of our PC servers and laptops? And that's what we're trying to accomplish at Eclypsium, is giving people visibility not just into the supply chain, but also threats and vulnerabilities that could live in these shadowy kind of areas that often don't get the same level of attention that higher things in the stack like your operating system get.
So you did allude to the fact that some vendors are delivering and not exactly operationalizing themselves how they're delivering their products and looking at their supply chain. So I would ask you who's doing a really bad job of it, but we don't want to have lawsuits over here of calling somebody out. So I'll go the other route. these appliance providers, and whether it's servers, whether it's network devices, VPNs, like, who's doing a really good job? Like, who's out there that you're like, man, that is an industry best practice that other CISOs, other CIOs, other CTOs should emulate on how to really operationalize, understand that supply chain.
I think, some things to look for are, does the company have a bug bounty program? Are they allowing people to discover vulnerabilities in their platform? And there's actually it's actually a consumer. Netgear is a consumer maker of consumer IoT devices. They've got probably the strongest bug bounty program that I've seen from that type of company making that type of devices. And so they're encouraging security researchers to look at their security of their devices and firmware, and then giving them basically, a payout through a bug bounty. I want to see more of that. Again, Netgear is the example because that's just like in my research when I was looking for bug bounty programs for these types of companies. Netgear is the one that comes up, in my opinion, with the best program. So that's one thing to look for. Another thing to look for is an automated firmware update. How are updates coming to that firmware? Is it happening automatically? Is it a process? Do they give you some kind of tool? How does that work? Because that's typically the answer we get when we go to remediation. Speaking of making it operational, typically the answer is update your firmware. Now, that's easy to say. It's much harder to do in production, right? Especially when it's something like a VPN appliance or a network switch or something like that. That could mean downtime. So, do they have an automatic update process? What does that look like? When you apply the update, does it mean downtime? Do they have facilities where the update can be done and minimize the amount of downtime for that device? So those are, two of the biggest things, in my opinion, when you're looking at a vendor and looking to procure something. We start building this checklist of what does that vendor do that will increase the likelihood that I'll get a more secure device out of the box.
Got it. No, thank you. I do want to ask, one last question here, which I like to know people's origin story. Every good hero and every good villain has an origin story. So, what took you from dabbling in computers? And I've seen that you learned on BASIC and Pascal. I remember I took Pascal in college as well. Mm-hmm. Like, what took you from that type of programming to deciding that you wanted to punish yourself and go with, as you mentioned, the stuff that's really hard to program, or in your case, break the stuff that's hard to program? So what was the catalyst for that transition into being software development into going into firmware and attacking firmware?
It's interesting, Enrique. I think in the early days when I worked for a university, and so when I started at the university, there was no security program. There was no tools, no solutions, not a whole bunch of process and procedures, some very high level stuff. And that was it. And so when I got there, one of the reasons I was hired at the university because I had experience in firewalls. And so as I built out the program, I was scanning the network. And you can imagine in early 2000s, scanning a university network, the just gems that you would find in the stories that I could tell from those times. But one of the things that I would discover on the network is a lot of printers. I think we have a lot less printers on networks today, I would hope. But certainly back then, there was a lot of printers. And I was like, no one is paying attention to these printers. I could find vulnerabilities. I could scan them. I could make the paper come out of them when I scan them, and it would just dump like reams of paper. My co-host on Paul Security Weekly, Larry Pesce, always tells a story of when he ran a scan and it just triggered the printer to start printing garbage. And the person in the office just kept feeding paper, like reams and reams of paper through the printer. And I was like, these devices don't have a keyboard, a mouse, a monitor, a user that sits in front of them. Like, this is really a ripe landscape for attacking these kind of devices. And then actually Larry and myself decided to write a book on Linksys WRT54G routers, which are Linux firmware-based MIPS processor devices. There was a pretty large hacking community around them. This was before Raspberry Pis became popular, right? And so we started looking at it, and I discovered the same things. I'm like, there's vulnerabilities here. Attackers can be stealthy. They can be persistent. There's no protections on these devices. Even basic memory protections oftentimes don't exist on these devices. And that problem over time, Enrique, never got better. And so when I was looking to make, the one of the transitions in my career, I said, I want to go back and I want to work in firmware security because that's where I'm super passionate. And that's where I believe we still have a lot of problems and a lot of work to do. And so that's why I chose, to continue kind of doing a lot more firmware based stuff.
I think it's a good choice. The devices have just multiplied. So yeah, we don't have printers anymore, but now everybody has some weird device they bought off of eBay or Amazon or off of a Chinese site, and they're just plugging them into networks, plug them onto the routers, and yeah, the vulnerabilities are just increasing. So I'm glad to have people like you out there. It's great that you were an evangelist, and I'm sure you'll continue to evangelize, but it's incredible that you're going back to being a researcher and solving some of these incredibly hard problems. So thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to have you here. And look, I'm looking forward to really working with you in the future. As our companies are working together. Great to hang out. Hopefully we can grab stogies together, a little bit of scotch, and just talk about computers.
It sounds great. Thanks so much, Enrique. And I'm looking forward to scotch and cigars. That's my jam.
I knew it was. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.